Again, I'm Miss Encartado, and I am your OLC here in Oral Communication in Context. So since last time, our topic is the process of communication. So our topic for today is all about the communication models. And the process of communication can be studied through the communication models. And when we say communication models or models of communication, these are conceptual models used to explain the human communication process or how we communicate with each other. Okay, of course, at the end of this lesson, you will be able to identify the three standard communication models. You will be able to differentiate the various models of communication. And lastly, at the end of this lesson, you will be able to distinguish the unique features of one communication process from the other. So let us first have the linear communication model. Okay, so when we say linear communication model, it is the first kind of model that experts have made to understand the process of communication. And there are four characteristics of the linear communication model. We have the unidirectional, the simple, persuasion, not mutual understanding, and lastly, of course, value psychological over social effects. But let us first have the unidirectional. So from the word itself, uni means one direction, meaning to say it is one-way communication. So the sender will send the message to the receiver with or without effect. For example, the sender will send the message or the sender will transmit a message to the receiver, while the receiver will only receive the message without expecting feedback or response. So that is unidirectional, meaning to say it is one direction or one way communication. Next, of course, we're going to have simple. So the linear communication model is simple, just like this illustration here. So there is only the beginning and end, but there is no interchanging of roles between the sender and the receiver. It's like the sender will send a message and the receiver will receive the message and it will end like that. So that is the simple under the linear or one of the characteristic of linear communication model. Next, of course, we have the persuasion, not mutual understanding. So the sender may persuade the receiver of the message, and the sender may also give advice to the receiver. But that doesn't mean that they both understand each other. Okay, so again, here in the persuasion, not mutual understanding, the sender may give advice to the receiver and the sender may also persuade the receiver, but that doesn't mean that they both understand each other or that they have mutual understanding, because here in the linear communication model, the receiver doesn't have a feedback or response, or the receiver will just receive the message. He or she doesn't have a feedback or response. And lastly, of course, under the characteristic of the linear communication model, we have the value psychological over social effects. So this model focuses more on the psychological effects, such as understanding the message that comes from the sender, rather than the social effects, which is building the relationship with the communicator. So they are not their purpose is not to build relationship with each other. So the main purpose of this is to understand the message that comes from the sender. So here in the linear communication model, we have no assurance that the message was effective because the sender is only concerned with the delivery of the message. So we will not able to know if whether the receiver has understood the message that we want to convey. Okay, so that is the linear communication model. Again, there are four characteristics. We have the unidirectional, we have the simple, we have the persuasion, not mutual understanding, and lastly, of course, we have the psychological over social effects. Under the linear communication model, we have the Shannon Weaver, just like what you can see here on your screen. So according to this, the Shannon Weaver model, also known as the information theory model, was primarily developed to illustrate transmission of electronic information back in 1948. So there are six elements. We have the information source or the sender. We have the transmitter or encoder. We have the channel. We also have the receptor or decoder. We also have the receiver or destination of the message. And lastly, of course, we have the noise. So again, this is an example of, or this is under the linear communication model, meaning to say we don't have feedback or response from the receiver. That is why it has only six elements. Okay, so this is how it works. Okay, so this is how it works. So the sender here can be you. Let us say that you are a sender. And the receiver, of course, can be your friend. So let us say that you is the sender and your friend will be the receiver. So the channel that you will use here is your mobile network, which is your signal. And of course, the encoder here will be your mobile network company. So we have Globe, Smart, Sun, Talk and Text, and more. And of course, the decoder here will be the receiver's smartphone, which is your friend's smartphone. So when you try to send a message to your friend, like for example, you're going to text her, like, let us meet tomorrow at exactly 8 a.m. And your friend only receives part of that message, like she or he only received, like, let us meet. So that is because of the disruption of your mobile signal, which is your channel. And that is what we call the noise. So this is how Shannon-Weaver model works. Of course, under the linear communication model, we also have the Berlow's SMCR model. According to this, David Berlow conceptualized the sender, message, channel, receiver SMCR model during the 60s. He postulated this model from the Shannon-Weaver information theory model and emphasized on the encoding and decoding parts of the process. So Berlow's model has four components, just like what you can see here on the screen. We have the source, or the sender, we have the message, we have the channel, and of course, we have the receiver. So that is why it is called the SMCR model. So from the initials of every component. So Berlo also stated that each of the components are affected by many factors. So let us first have the source or the sender. So this is the source of the message or the person who originates the message. The sender or source sends the message to the receiver. And of course, these are the factors related to the source and also same in the case of the receiver. So let us first have the communication skills. So communication skills of a person is a factor that affects the communication process. So if the sender is not good in communicating, the message might be lost in the process of transmittal. And it includes writing, speaking, listening, and of course, reading. For example, your friend wrote or sent you a letter. Your friend wrote a letter for you. But then you couldn't understand what your friend is trying to say since uh, his or her penmanship is not understandable. So that is one of the factor that affects the communication process. It is how we're going to communicate. So it includes the writing, how we write, how we listen to the message that will be sent for us, or how we send the message. Is speaking, of course, listening, reading, and more. So those are under the sender. And that is one of the factors that affect the communication process, which is the communication skill. Also, the sender's attitude towards others and towards himself or herself can affect the meaning of the message that he or she wants to convey. So when we say knowledge, if the sender is familiar with the subject or with the topic or with the message that he or she will going to send, of course, it will add value or impact on the message or to the message. And for the social system, so here in social system, the beliefs, religions, social status, values, and other social factors can affect how the sender communicates the message and how the receiver receives the message or understand the message. And lastly, of course, we have the culture. So some culture may accept something while the other may find it offensive. Just like our example last time, on the Western countries, it's okay to call them on their first name, even though they are older than you. So it's okay to call them Maria or Jan, even though they are older than you. Yet here in the Philippines, most people will get offended if they are older than you and you call them by their first name. So you have to add ate, kuya, tito, tita, something like that. So that is the culture. Some culture may accept something while the other may find it offensive. So cultural difference can make it difficult to communicate. So we have different culture, right? Next, of course, we have the message under SMCR model of communication. Under the message, we have the content. And when we say content, this is the entire message. Okay, the entire message that the sender or the source wants to convey. Of course, we have the elements. So these are body gestures, body language, haptics. Can you still remember the haptics? Okay, when we say haptics, again, this is the language of touch. Examples are pat on the back, appear. What else? Who wants to give me example of haptics? Which is the language of touch? Anyone on the chat box? Hug, according to Verna. That is correct. Okay. So those are the example of haptics, which is the language of touch. We have the hug, pat on the back or tap on the back, appear, fist bump, and more. So it also includes the holding hands. That is an example of haptics. Next, of course, and that is under the elements. Next, of course, we have the treatment. So when you say treatment, this is how the message is conveyed. So you're going to send the message through yelling, are soft? Is it loud? Something like that. And of course, under the message, we have the structure. So from the word itself, structure, it refers to the arrangement of the elements in the content of the message. And lastly, of course, we have the code. So code is the form in which the message will be sent. So we can send the message through videos or in the form of videos, spoken words, text, and more. And of course, here in the SMCR model, we have the channel. And here in the SMCR model, channel simply means the five senses. We can use our sense of hearing as a channel. So we have your sense of hearing, seeing, touching, of course. And it also includes smelling. For example, if we smell of something burning, it means that we are in a danger or the fire is nearby. Another is the tasting. For example, the food is sweet or salty. It means that you have a pleasant mood or you are in a good mood. So that is one of the channel. While if the food is sour or bitter, that means that you have an unpleasant mood or you are in a bad mood. So that is the tasting. Again, here in the channel, these are the sense of hear. So it simply means it simply means the five senses. We have the hearing, seeing, touching, smelling. Tasting also it includes tasting and smelling. And lastly, of course, we have the receiver under the SMCR model. So the receiver and the sender has or have the same element. So we also have the communication skills, attitudes, knowledge, social system, and culture. So that is the Burles SMCR model. Next, of course, we have the transactional communication model. So when we say transactional communication model, it refers to the continuous exchange of information. So the sender and the receiver are involved in this process and they are taking their turn to communicate the message, and we're going to call them the communicators. Under the transactional model of communication or transactional communication model, we have the Dances helix model. According to this, the helical model of communication was conceptualized in 1967 by Frank Dance. A helix is an object having a three-dimensional shape that, like of a wire wound, uniformly around the cylinder or cone, like a corkscrew or coil that grows bigger and bigger as it moves up. According to this, again, the helix communication model illustrates how the development and growth of communication or communicative actions will always be based on previous experiences or behaviors. The communication while moving forward is at the same time coming back to itself and being affected by its past behavior. So this is according to Dance in 1967. This model shows how the knowledge base of a person deepens and expands throughout life. This model also shows that a person's understanding of a message or thought is influenced by external and internal factors that are learned throughout life. So in order for you to understand this Dance's helix model, I have here an illustration. So this is how it really looks like. It looks like a spiral. So and it grows bigger and bigger as it moves up. Kasi dito it is more on a zigzag, right? But this is how it really looks like. It looks like a spiral. So of course, when we were babies, the only way we can communicate was through crying. So that is our means of communication when we are hungry, when we are scared, when we are or when we are uncomfortable or when we are startled, we're going to cry, right? Because that is our means of communication. That is the only way we can communicate when we were still babies. We don't know words yet. So that is what we call crying. And of course, our parents will give us milk, change our diapers. They will also carry us and put us to sleep. But then when we become toddler, of course, we still use crying as a language or when we were communicating. But little by little, we learned minimal words because in the toddler stage or in this stage, we also learned how to speak. So aside from crying to get what we want, we also communicate using the words that we learn. And also, as we grow older, our vocabulary increases. We can now speak fluently with our own mother tongue or with our own language. So we're not using only words to communicate. We now know how to use nonverbal cues. We now know how to use gestures, facial expressions, haptics, just like what your examples a while ago. Okay, and according to the Dance's helix model or the helical model of communication, the process of the communication evolves. So from the very birth of an individual and continues till the existing moment. So that is the Dance's helix model. Next, of course, we're going to have the interactive communication model. Interactive communication model, also known as convergence model, emphasizes the coding and decoding components of the process. It also focuses on the cycle of message exchanges between the sender and the receiver. The source of the message will need to encode the message, while the receiver will need to decode the message. These messages will be affected by the field of experiences. These are communication patterns rising from the factors such as psychological, social, cultural, societal, or situational experiences or gained knowledge. This model also takes into consideration noise as a form of barrier in communication. Example of this is the Yali communication. Just like what we've talked about last time, this is all about when two persons are communicating with each other. Another example is communicating with yourself, which is the intrapersonal communication. So I have here an example of interactive communication model. We have here the Scrum's communication model. So it has the following components. We have the sender, encoder, decoder, interpreter, receiver, message, feedback, medium or media, noise, and lastly, of course, we have the field of experience. So, of course, we will first start by the sender or the source of the message. The sender will encode the message that he or she will eventually deliver to the receiver. And then, of course, the receiver will decode or get the message and tries to interpret it. And then, after the receiver tries to interpret or understand and analyze the message, the receiver will also have a response or feedback in which his message will also be delivered to the sender a while ago. But now the sender and the receiver or the sender can now be a receiver and the receiver can now be the sender. And of course, the process will continue, meaning to say the receiver and the sender can switch with each other as they continue to exchange the message. So that is the Scrum's communication model. And according to the Scrum's communication model, this model can be used in interpersonal and interpersonal communication. Just like what I've said a while ago, interpersonal means when the two person are communicating with each other. Another is the intrapersonal communication, meaning to say you are communicating with yourself. So meaning to say you can be the receiver or the sender, and in the interpersonal communication, your friend can be the receiver and the sender, and you can be the receiver and the sender also. According to this, a simple example of how this happens in real life. You are the sender and your friend is the receiver. The communication is initiated by the sender, of course. The message is first processed in the sender's brain rather, then sent to the mouth to be transmitted. The message is then delivered to your friend through through language, your voice, symbols, and nonverbal cues. While sharing the message, you may encounter disruptions or noise. So that is one of the barrier, the noise. Your friend will in turn try to understand the message and will react or give feedback accordingly. This process repeats until one of them ends the process. So that is the Scrum's communication model. Again, the receiver and the sender here in the Scrum's communication model can switch with each other as they continue to exchange the message. So that would be all for today. If you have questions or clarifications, you may now chat it on the chat box.